I knew something was wrong before I even pulled all the way into my driveway. Maybe you've had that feeling before. The kind where your brain notices something out of place before your eyes can explain it. I lived at the very end of a quiet street called Willow Ridge Court, where my half-acre lot backed up against a community event lawn owned by the Homeowners Association. It wasn't a fancy place. I had 2 old maple trees that dropped leaves into my yard every fall, a weather-beaten storage shed that desperately needed a fresh coat of paint, and a cracked concrete walkway I'd been meaning to replace for 3 summers. I liked it that way, peaceful, predictable. Nobody bothered me, and I didn't bother anybody. Well, at least that had been true until our HOA elected a new president named Denise Caldwell. Denise had the kind of personality that made every conversation feel like she was issuing a citation. She smiled with her mouth but never with her eyes, and somehow every sentence out of her mouth started with the words, "According to the bylaws." She believed the neighborhood existed to serve the board instead of the other way around. The first few months after she took over were mostly annoying. Letters about grass height, emails about garbage cans being visible from the street for an extra hour after pickup, complaints because my shed wasn't painted one of the 4 approved shades of beige. I ignored most of it because I knew my property rights, and I wasn't about to repaint a perfectly functional shed simply because someone with too much free time decided weathered wood offended them. Still, Denise never forgot when someone challenged her authority. Looking back, I think that's where this whole mess really started. That Thursday afternoon, I turned off the truck and walked toward my backyard carrying a bag of groceries. But halfway across the lawn, I froze. 3 sections of my back fence were gone. Not damaged. Not blown over by a storm. Removed. Whoever had done it had pried the boards off cleanly, leaving fresh splinters scattered across the grass. Through the opening, I could see bright orange extension cords stretched across my yard like somebody had set up a temporary construction site. I dropped the groceries right there on the walkway and followed the cord with my eyes until it disappeared behind my old shed. My stomach tightened. "You got to be kidding me," I muttered to myself as I hurried across the yard. Sure enough, the extension cord was plugged directly into the outdoor electrical sub-panel mounted on the side of my shed. That panel wasn't shared infrastructure. It wasn't HOA property. It supplied electricity to my workshop, my backyard lights, and a small freezer inside the shed where I stored fishing bait during the summer. Somebody had opened the weatherproof cover, plugged into one of my outlets, then taped a bright yellow warning sticker across the breaker box. It read, "Do not discontinue. Event in progress." I actually laughed for a second because it was so unbelievably arrogant. They hadn't even asked. They hadn't left a note explaining the situation. They'd cut through my fence, connected their equipment to my electrical system, and then left instructions telling me what I wasn't allowed to do with my own property. It almost felt like a prank until I noticed muddy boot prints leading back through the missing fence toward the HOA event lawn. I walked through the opening and immediately understood what was happening. On the other side, dozens of rental workers were setting up a massive charity gala scheduled for Saturday night. Decorative light poles were stacked beside the lawn. Caterers were unloading refrigerators. Sound technicians were running speaker cables. The place looked like preparations for a wedding reception. One of the workers glanced at me and casually said, "Hey, don't trip over those cords, okay?" Like I worked for them, like this was all perfectly normal. I didn't argue with him because I knew he wasn't making the decisions. Instead, I quietly took out my phone and started documenting everything. Every missing fence board, every footprint, every extension cord, every angle of that ridiculous yellow sticker. Then I photographed my electrical meter, my panel serial number, and the property line markers I'd had surveyed years earlier after settling a dispute with my previous neighbor. Experience had taught me something valuable over the years. Emotions fade, but photographs never change their story. That evening, I drove to the county permit office before it closed. A woman named Melissa recognized my address almost immediately after typing it into the system. "Your shed sub panel?" she asked. "That's registered entirely to your parcel. Nobody else has legal access to that service." I asked if there was any easement, any shared utility agreement, anything I might have forgotten since buying the property nearly 12 years earlier. She turned her monitor slightly so I could see the records myself. Nothing. Zero. Complete private ownership. Before driving home, I made one more phone call to a licensed electrician I'd hired a few years earlier during a kitchen remodel. I explained exactly what had happened. There was a brief pause before he chuckled. "Ryan, he said. It's your outlet. If somebody plugs into your power without permission, disconnecting it isn't their decision. It's yours. That sentence stayed with me all night. Because suddenly this wasn't about electricity anymore. It was about boundaries. And I had a feeling Denise Caldwell had just made the biggest mistake. Slept better that night than I probably should have. Maybe it was because once I'd confirmed the facts, all the uncertainty disappeared. I wasn't wondering whether I was overreacting anymore. I wasn't asking myself if maybe the HOA had some obscure legal right I'd overlooked. They didn't. They'd simply assumed that because my shed happened to sit closest to their event lawn, they could help themselves to whatever was convenient. That realization changed everything. Friday morning, I woke up early, poured myself a cup of black coffee, sat on my back porch looking directly at the gap they'd carved through my fence, and started writing. Not an angry letter, not a rant, just a simple, professional notice. I listed the date and time unauthorized access had been discovered. I identified the electrical service by its panel number. I documented the removal of fence boards without permission. Then I wrote one sentence that mattered more than anything else. Unauthorized equipment connected to my private electrical service will be disconnected at exactly 5:7 on Saturday. Any future entry onto my property without written authorization will be reported immediately to the sheriff's office. There were no threats, no insults, no emotional language, just facts. I printed 2 copies, mailed one by certified mail to the HOA office, hand-delivered another to the management company's receptionist, and kept every receipt in a folder that was already beginning to get thicker than I expected. Around lunchtime, my neighbor, Carl Jensen, wandered over while walking his Labrador. Carl had lived across the street for nearly 20 years and had watched HOA boards come and go like bad weather. He looked through the missing fence boards, then looked at me. "They really did this?" he asked. I nodded. Without asking, Carl shook his head slowly. "Denise has gotten way too comfortable telling people what belongs to her." He laughed quietly before adding, "You're not reconnecting anything after 5 tomorrow, are you?" I smiled into my coffee. "Depends how polite they decide to become." Carl laughed so hard he almost dropped the dog's leash. By Friday evening, the event lawn had transformed into something straight out of a wedding magazine. Rental crews were everywhere. White linen covered dozens of round tables. Tall floral arrangements arrived in refrigerated trucks. A company was installing decorative string lights across custom poles planted around the lawn. Workers tested the sound system while another crew unloaded industrial refrigerators for desserts and drinks. I sat on my deck pretending to read a book, but I was really watching every extension cord. Every single one eventually disappeared through the opening in my fence. It almost amazed me how much money had been invested in an event that depended entirely on electricity nobody had permission to use. Lampford that afternoon, my phone rang. Denise. I let it go to voicemail. 30 seconds later, another call. Then another. Finally, she left a message. "Ryan, we received your letter. Obviously, there's been some misunderstanding. The board approved temporary access for this weekend's fundraiser. Please call me immediately." I listened twice before deleting it. Notice what she never said. She never apologized. She never admitted someone cut through my fence. She never asked for permission. She simply informed me the board had approved using something they didn't own. Saturday morning arrived warm and bright. One of those perfect late spring days where the sky looks almost painted. Around 8 o'clock, I walked out to inspect my fence again. The opening was still there. Fresh tire tracks crossed the grass where equipment had been rolled through my yard instead of using the designated service entrance nearly 200 feet away. That annoyed me almost more than the electricity. They hadn't just borrowed power. They'd treated my backyard like an extension of HOA property. Around 10 o'clock, another neighbor stopped by, this time Linda Morales, who volunteered at nearly every community fundraiser. "Ryan," she said carefully, "I heard there's some disagreement." I couldn't help smiling. That's one way to describe it. She looked genuinely uncomfortable. "The charity tonight raises money for the Children's Hospital." I nodded. "That's wonderful. I support the hospital every year." "Then maybe just let this one go." I looked toward the event lawn where workers were arranging expensive centerpieces beneath lights powered by my electrical panel. "Linda," I asked quietly, "if someone parked in your garage without asking because they were raising money for charity, would that suddenly make it okay?" She opened her mouth, paused, then sighed. "No, I guess it wouldn't." "Exactly. Good causes don't erase bad behavior." She nodded slowly before walking away. and I could tell she understood even if she wished the timing had been different. By early afternoon, expensive cars began filling the temporary parking area. Guests arrived wearing suits, cocktail dresses, polished shoes that definitely weren't designed for grass. Live musicians tuned violins near the stone fountain, while servers carried trays of champagne between tables. Everything looked flawless. It honestly would have been beautiful if I hadn't known what was hiding behind my shed. Around 4 o'clock, I checked my watch for what felt like the 20th time. Then I walked inside, opened the folder containing every photograph, every permit, every certified mail receipt, and every county record I'd collected over the past 2 days. I placed them neatly on my kitchen table beside another document I'd prepared that morning. An invoice. Unauthorized property access fee, $900. Licensed electrical safety inspection, $200. Emergency reconnection service, $400. Total due before reconnection, $1,500. Was that amount arbitrary? No. I'd actually called my electrician again and asked what emergency service calls, inspections, and after-hours reconnects typically cost. Then I'd added a reasonable access fee for the trespass. Everything was defensible. Everything had a paper trail. At 4:30, the music officially started. Through my kitchen window, I could hear applause as the event host welcomed nearly 200 guests. Someone began giving a speech about community spirit and neighbors helping neighbors. I nearly laughed out loud at the irony. Community spirit apparently ended exactly where my property line began. At 4:45, another voicemail from Denise arrived. Her voice sounded less confident this time. "Ryan, we're willing to discuss compensation after the event. Please don't create a scene," I whispered to myself. I don't need to create one. 5 minutes later, I stepped outside carrying nothing except the key to my backyard gate. The evening sunlight had turned golden, washing everything in warm light that made the event look almost cinematic. Guests clinked wine glasses. A jazz quartet played softly beneath strings of glowing lights. Children chased each other across the grass while photographers captured smiling couples beneath illuminated oak trees. Nobody noticed me quietly walking toward the shed. I unlocked my gate, stepped inside, and closed it behind me. My boots crunched softly across the gravel. Every sound suddenly felt louder because I knew exactly what was about to happen. I knelt beside the outdoor subpanel, opened the weatherproof cover, and looked at the bright orange extension cord someone else had plugged into my outlet without asking. I checked my watch one final time. 4,059, 58 seconds, 59. Then the second hand reached 12. Exactly 5:01 p.m. I wrapped one hand around the extension cord, gave it a firm pull, and unplugged it in one smooth motion. There wasn't an explosion. There wasn't the dramatic spark. Just one quiet click, followed by absolute silence as hundreds of lights vanished in a single sweeping wave across the event lawn. The music stopped mid-note. Refrigeration alarms began echoing through the sudden darkness beneath the catering tents. And somewhere beyond my fence, I heard 200 confused voices all asking the exact same question at once. Oh, of her time as HOA president. For about 3 seconds, nobody moved. It was almost surreal. One moment, the entire lawn was glowing with warm white lights, music drifting through the evening air, servers carrying trays between laughing guests. And the next, it all simply stopped. Darkness rolled across the event space like someone had pulled a curtain over it. The quartet lowered their instruments mid-song. Conversations dissolved into confused murmurs. The catering truck started shrieking because its refrigeration system had suddenly lost power. Somewhere near the fountain, I heard somebody say, "Did we blow a transformer?" Another voice answered, "No." The whole neighborhood still has power. I quietly closed the weatherproof cover on my panel, locked it, secured the backyard gate behind me, walked through my kitchen, and poured myself another cup of coffee. There was something oddly satisfying about hearing complete chaos outside while my coffee maker continued brewing without the slightest interruption. About 20 minutes later, the pounding started. Not a polite knock, real pounding. I opened the front door to find Denise Caldwell standing on my porch with 2 board members behind her, all 3 of them looking like they'd just watched their vacation house catch fire. "Ryan," Denise snapped before I could even say hello. "Plug it back in, right now." I leaned casually against the doorframe. "Good evening to you too." Her face tightened. "This event has almost 200 guests. I'm aware. You're ruining a charity fundraiser." "No," I replied calmly. "I'm protecting private property. Those are two very different things. One of the board members stepped forward. We'll reimburse your electric bill later. I couldn't help smiling. This stopped being about my electric bill the moment someone cut through my fence. Denise folded her arms. You're being unreasonable. Without saying another word, I walked inside, picked up the folder from my kitchen table, and returned to the porch. I handed her the invoice first. She stared at it. Unauthorized property access fee, electrical inspection, emergency reconnection, total due before service restoration, $1,500. This is ridiculous, she said. Actually, I answered, the ridiculous part was leaving a sticker on my electrical panel telling me not to touch my own outlet. She looked up sharply, but before she could answer, I handed her the certified mail receipt showing delivery the previous afternoon, followed by copies of the county property records confirming exclusive ownership of the electrical service, then photographs of the missing fence boards, the extension cord, the boot prints, and finally a written opinion from my licensed electrician confirming that disconnecting unauthorized equipment attached to my private outlet was completely lawful. I watched her confidence disappear one document at a time. Nobody raised their voice anymore. Nobody threatened lawsuits. The conversation had quietly shifted from demands to damage control. So, I finally asked, would you like to settle the invoice tonight? Or should we discuss the trespassing report with the sheriff's office tomorrow morning? Denise looked at the two board members beside her. Neither one said a word. They simply stared at the paperwork. Eventually, she muttered, "We'll take this back to the board." I nodded. That sounds like a good idea. Monday morning, just after 9, an overnight envelope arrived. Inside was a cashier's check for the full amount. No letter, no apology, just the payment. I almost admired the efficiency. They'd finally realized that arguing would only create more records they couldn't explain later. I deposited the check that afternoon and hired a fencing contractor to replace every damaged board with brand new cedar instead of the old weathered pine. If someone else was paying, I figured I might as well upgrade. A week later, I received another call from the HOA management company, but this time the tone couldn't have been more different. They wanted a meeting, not to argue, to negotiate. We met in the clubhouse conference room, and for the first time since Denise became president, nobody sat at the head of the table pretending to be in charge. They asked what it would take if the association ever needed temporary access to my electrical service again. I slid a typed agreement across the table. 30 days written notice before any request. Annual utility access payment due every January whether they used the service or not. Written approval required for any equipment placed within 15 feet of my shed. No entry onto my property without my presence or written consent. Any damage repaired within 7 business days by licensed contractors of my choosing. Denise read every page in complete silence. Finally, she looked up and asked, "These are your final terms?" I smiled. "Those are my first terms. You never asked before." After a long pause, she signed. So did the rest of the board. Funny how quickly people discover respect once convenience becomes expensive. It's been almost 3 years since all of that happened. Every January, right on schedule, the HOA sends the annual access payment without a reminder. Whenever they need power for an event, someone calls weeks in advance, asks politely, and waits for an answer instead of assuming one. My fence has never been touched again. Look at that. I don't think the biggest lesson is about electricity, fences, or even the HOA. It's about boundaries. Some people convince themselves that being in charge of a neighborhood somehow makes them owners of everyone else's property. Eventually, they stop asking because nobody has ever forced them to. Sometimes the most effective way to remind someone where the line isn't by shouting, threatening, or getting even. It's by quietly closing the circuit they never had permission to open in the first place. Now I'm curious what you think. If you had come home and found your HOA had cut through your fence and plugged into your power without even asking, would you have handled it the same way, or would you have done something completely different? Let me know down in the comments. Because stories like this always spark some pretty heated debates. And if you enjoy real neighborhood conflicts, property rights stories, and moments where patience beats arrogance, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next one.